All right, Rabbi, say good morning. Let us begin. Let's begin by thanking our sponsors for today's shir, to thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Tishrei, to thank Avraham and Shaindy Kelman for dedicating all the shiurim and drushos this month in memory of their parents, to thank Jack Bennett for dedicating all the shiurim and drushos this month in memory of First Sergeant Nikolai Rappaport, Dr. Linda Weinberg for dedicating the shiurim this month in memory of her husband, Dr. Paul Weinberg, parents Moishe Ben Avraham David. To thank our Day of Learning sponsors, Sara Rubinstein, in memory of her beloved husband, Rubinstein. Our Daf Yomi sponsors, Mordechai and Malky Tusk, in honor of Mordechai's 4th anniversary of Daf Yomi learning. Mazel tov, Mazel Mordechai. I think he just went to get coffee. With special hakaras hatov to Ari Lerner and Moishe Abramson. Beautiful. To thank Mel Rom for dedicating today's shir in commemoration of his grandfather's yahrzeit, Shmuel Ben Avraham. Zichron Livracha, and to Yehuda and Bracha Buchwalter for dedicating today's shir as a nischus of a mazel tov on the engagement of their daughter Esther Menucha, to Yitzchak Aberbach, mazel tov to the Buchwalter Mishpacha. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, all of the neshamas will have an aliyah, the families in Nechama, and Meretz Hashem, simchas for all of Klal Yisrael. But with that, let us begin. Today's daf is Chav Zayin 27. We have a lot to do today as we left off on Chav Vav Amud Beis 26b, and we left off about 20 lines up from the bottom. Ba'imine hilal mirava yesh muktzah l'chatzi Shabbos o in muktzah l'chatzi Shabbos. Well, so remember again, we actually read this, but let's take a look at it. Let's take a look at it once more. All right, thank you so much. I was going to get afterwards. Thank you. So the shaila the Gemara was dealing with is as follows. Is there muktzah for Chatzi Shabbos? Which means that halacha l'maisa, if you have something where the muktzah status begins one way and then ultimately changes afterwards, does that work? Does the muktzah status change? For example, the Gemara says, Hechi dami, ida achzi ben hashmashos achzi, ida lo achzi lo achzi. What does that mean? The Gemara says, well, we know muktzah is determined ben hashmashos. So if halacha l'maisa, the item was fit for use ben hashmashos, then it's fit for use. If it's not fit for use, then it's not fit for use. Both say, so the shaila was, if something was fit, then becomes unfit, and then becomes refit, what's its muktzah status? What's the halacha? Amar le yesh muktzah. See, he responded, there is muktzah. In other words, Rabbi say that halacha l'maisa, if something ultimately wasn't muktzah, was permitted, then became muktzah, and then subsequently morphed back into its original permitted state, the item once again becomes permitted, Suppose that's the lashon of, the concept of muktzah applies. If you look at Rashi, actually, let's go right there. So the Gemara says, Eisve, he raised the kasha, is that really true? B'shavin shim nolad umumo imo, shezem min amuchan. But going back to yesterday's daf, so we spoke about the idea that everyone agreed that if halacha l'maisa, the Bechar was born, and along with the Bechar was the mum of the Bechar, right? The Bechar was born with its mum, that halacha l'maisa, everyone agreed that the animal is permitted. Va'amai. Now, why is that so? Let's make the following argument. Neima, hai Bechar me'ikara havachazi agav ime. Suppose say this is fascinating. At the onset of Yom Tov, the Bechar was permitted. Now, interestingly enough, why was the Bechar permitted? Not because of the Bechar. The Bechar was permitted by dint of its mother. In other words, that if you were to shecht that mother, and inside you were to find the Bechar animal, the Bechar animal would become permitted, als the mother. Therefore, what happens? So therefore, when Yom Tov started, the Bechar, so to speak, was permitted. Is yalidle, when the Bechar is born, idchile, ultimately, again, it becomes set aside for non-use, right? Because halacha l'maisa, once it's born, now it's a Bechar. Achzi l'chacham ishtarile. Ultimately, again, once halacha l'maisa, you go out and you show it to the chacham, now it becomes permitted again. So remember, everyone agrees, well, at least as we said yesterday, everyone agreed that halacha l'maisa, when the Bechar is born with its mum, it becomes permitted. The Gemara wants to suggest, why should that be so? Is this not a case of an animal or an entity that was permitted, muktzah, and then permitted again? Amar le'Abaye v'Timur of Safra kigon diasvi dayani hasam. No, what's the case? The case is where the dayanim were sitting there. Elizabeth says it's quite fascinating. So at the birth of the animal, the dayanim were sitting right there and paskined on the animal immediately upon its birth. So there was never a moment in time where the animal was prohibited. The moment it was born, the dayanim paskin that the animal is a balmum and therefore permitted. Ikeda Amri, an alternate version of this, Amrle ein muktzah lechatzi Shabbos. Others said there is no muktzah, right? Partial muktzah for Shabbos. So the Gemara says, let's bring a proof to that concept. V'shavin shem nolad umumo imo shezem min hamuchan. Ultimately, again, everyone agreed, the same case, that if the bachar is born with its mum, that halacha lamaisa, it is permitted on Yom Tiv. But yet the bachar itself, initially when Yom Tiv started, was permitted by dint of its mother. Is yaladle, once it's born, idchile, it is set aside for non-use because it's a bachar. Achsi the chacham, ishtarile, and ultimately, again, once you show it to the chacham, now it becomes permitted. So Amar Abaye v'Timur of Safra kigon diyasvi dayani hasam. What's the case? The case is where the judges were sitting there, and therefore halacha lamaisa permitted the animal immediately. Good. So we'll say the point of where the Gemara is just doing is you could actually bring that case to support either way of this argument. Good. So we'll say, so ultimately the Gemara says as follows. The Gemara says as another case, Tashma, Haya ochel ba'anav. Listen to this interesting case. If you were eating fruit, and what happened? V'hosir, and you had leftover fruit, this is grapes, v'hosir, v'helon lagag la'asos men simukin. So you're eating grapes, you have leftover grapes, you want to take them out to the roof to dry out, and they'll become raisins on the roof. Or b'te'enim v'hosir v'helon la'asos men grogros. So, or same thing with figs. You have leftover figs, you want to take them out to the rooftop to dry them out. Lo yochal mehen ad sheyazmin mibaod yom. You cannot eat from them unless, of course, you identify. Yaz means you prepare. You prepare them before Yom Tiv. V'chin ata motzei ba'afar sikin u'bechavushin u'b'shar kol minei peros. And this is true for all fruits. So we'll say, this is a case where you have fruit that was fit for consumption. You're now taking it up to the roof to go ahead and dry it out. So the Gemara says you may not eat from it on Shabbos / Yom Tiv, unless, of course, you're mazmin it before Shabbos Yom Tov. Which the Gemara says, well, what's the case? Hechi dami, id dechazu lamale hazmana. I don't understand. If you're eating from it, that means it's fit for consumption. If it's fit for consumption, then why does it require hazmana? Id lo chazu, and if they're not fit for consumption, ki azmin le my havi. Then ultimately, again, what does going ahead and preparing it for consumption have to do with anything? So maybe you'll taina, it's the case where you don't know, is it fit, is it not fit? Ve'ein habayl lemakirin bo mutter. Yet when Rabbi said the case of muktzah sheyavash. Ultimately, again, if you have an item that dried out and the owners don't know about it, if it still remains mutter. Rather, what's the case? Rabbi says, here's what's fascinating. Apparently, when you dry out fruit, there's in the beginning before it dries out, right? By the way, when you say dry out, I don't mean dry out like becomes like inedible. They're drying fruit. Right, you're creating dried fruit. When you're creating dried fruit, apparently it's edible, obviously, in its regular state. There's some portion in the drying process where the fruit becomes inedible, and then it becomes edible again when the drying process is done. So that's what it means. It was fit, became unfit, and then it became refit. And if ultimately, again, you hold that there's no kind of, reversible state of muktzah, as long as it was edible at the beginning, that's enough. Ella my yesh muktzah. Rather, both say, what do you see? You see ultimately again that yesh muktzah. If that's the case, ki azmin lahu my havi. If you're mazmin it? What does that have to do with anything? How does that help? This is very interesting. That the fruit itself was kind of in an in-between state of edibility. The fruit was in a state where some people eat it, some people don't eat it. So therefore, again, the azmin galei daite, lo azmin lo galei daite. So I'll say, interestingly enough, when you have fruit in that in-between state of edibility, so if you're mazmin it, it's prepared for use. If you're not mazmin it, it's not prepared for use. Good. Amar yizera tashma mipulin va'adoshin. You could also learn this halacha from lentils and beans. The hapulin va'adoshin meikara chazulakos. Because interestingly enough, when you have lentils and beans, in the beginning, they're fit to chew on, right? You could use it. However, shadinu bekara, once you throw them into a pot, idchuluhu, there's a period of time where they become inedible, top of chav zayin. Gamar bishulayhu chazuluhu. Once the cooking is finished, they once again become edible. So we'll say, all the Gemara is just doing is illustrating this idea that sometimes you could have a food item that is fit for use, then because the part of the production is unfit for use, and then it becomes refit for use. To which the Gemara says, the truth is, you could ask this shayla on general cooking. After all, the hastam kederos da'alma ben hashmashos roschos hein ula artach linan mihur. Both say very often when you're preparing for Yom Tov, for Shabbos, reisa halacha lamaisa, ben hashmashos, the pot is boiling. When the pot is boiling, it's not really fit for consumption. You can't eat it when it's boiling, and then you eat it later on in the evening. So the Gemara says, Ela gamru bide adam lo kami boila. No. But I will say that's a case, ultimately, again, of a change in state that's initiated by man's actions. Ki kami boilan, gamru bide shamayim. Ultimately, again, when do we have a shayla? Our shayla deals with the situation of gamru bide shamayim. So I'll just show you. Coming back. Just wanna. In just this halacha, we actually had this in our in Hilchos Muktzah, in Shin Yud Siv Gimel. The Shulchan Aruch paskins about Yesh Muktzah Lechatzi Shabbos, in Muktzah Lechatzi Shabbos, which is a fundamental yisodistic shayla by Hilchos Muktzah, which is, does the status of an item change? Does the status of an item change over the course of Shabbos? So the Shulchan Aruch paskins, this is in Shin Yud Siv Gimel, Bein be'isr achila, bein be'isr tiltul, kol davar shahaya ra'i ben hashmashos. Anything that was permitted ben hashmashos, im ira bo davar shenis kalkel bo bayom, v'chazer v'niskan bo bayom, chazer lehetero. So listen to this. This is how Hilchos Muktzah goes both ways. On one hand, if something was permitted at ben hashmashos, then becomes prohibited at some point in Shabbos, then once again becomes permitted over Shabbos, halacha l'maisa, the item is permitted. The item is permitted. On the flip side, aval davar shehuktzah ben hashmashos asar kalayom. So I will say, Hilchos Muktzah is fascinating this way. If you're muktzah at the onset of Shabbos, your muktzah status remains intact the entire Shabbos, even if your circumstances change. If you start asar. But if you start out Shabbos mutter, and then something happens that renders you unfit or asr or muktzah, but then that circumstance changes back to what it originally was, the item becomes mutter again. Hilchos Muktzah. Good, let's go weiter. Rabbi Huda Nesiya Haveli Ahu Buchra. Rabbi Huda Nesiya had a Bukhar animal, Shadra Kamid Rabbi Ami. He sent it before Rabbi Ami, right? So he sent it to Rabbi Ami on Yom Tiv for Rabbi Ami to go ahead and look at it. So the Gemara says, Rabbi Ami felt that ultimately, again, he really should not look at the animal, that he just should not examine the Bechor animal. Because we'll say it's Yom Tiv, and the assumption is that we're not really looking at a Bechor on Yom Tiv. But yet we know that in general, when we have halacha Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Shimon, we paskin like Rabbi Yehuda. And I will say again, remember Rabbi Yehuda. What did Rabbi Yehuda say in the Mishnah? Rabbi Yehuda in the Mishnah said that halacha l'maisa, it was a case of the bechar shenafal lebar. Rabbi Yehuda allowed the mumcha to go and take a look at the mum. Take a look at the mum. We'll say if you take a look at Rashi says over here. Let's go weiter. So the Gemara says, Hadar Shadre, the Kamid Rabbi Yitzchak Nafka. So then what happened? So Rabbi Huda Nesiya sent the animal to Rabbi Yitzchak Nafka. Savar Delol Mechsir. Rabbi Yitzchak Nafka also assumed, you know what? I'm not going to examine the animal. Amar Rabbi Yirmiyah v'Tana Rabbi Zreika, Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Shimon, halacha Rabbi Yehuda. Once again, if you have halacha Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Shimon, we assume the halacha follows Rabbi Yehuda. Amar Rabbi Abba, my taima lo shav kisinhu rabbana leme'avid uvduk Rabbi Shimon. Why do you not allow the rabbis to pass like Rabbi Shimon, and therefore again not look at a bachar on Yom Tiv? Amar le va'at ma biyadech. First wide line I will say, why do you assume the halacha does follow Rabbi Shimon, that you would not look at a bachar animal on Yom Tiv? Amar le hacham Rabbi Zera halacha like Rabbi Shimon. Okay, because Rabbi Zera said the halacha follows Rabbi Shimon. I suppose so that's like a pretty explicit halacha over there, that the halacha follows Rabbi Shimon. That's why we would not look at a bachar animal on Yom Tiv. Supposed to listen to this. So the Gemara says as follows: Amar Manduhu. So there was a Talmud Chacham in the Beis Medrash who heard this entire exchange. So he heard now quoted in the name of Rabbi Zera that the halacha follows Rabbi Shimon. So what he said: Amar Manduhu aski va'asik lahasam. V'agmara l'shmaisa mi pumei demara. So this particular Talmud Chacham said, one day I hope I'm privileged to go to Eretz Yisrael to be able to hear this ruling from the mouth of Rabbi Zera. Okay? Kisalach lahasam. One day he made it to Eretz Yisrael. Ashkechel Rabbi Zera. And he found Rabbi Zera. He said to Rabbi Zera, Amar lei, Amar mar halacha Rabbi Shimon. So he said, Rabbi, is it true that you said the halacha follows Rabbi Shimon, and therefore again we do not look at Mumin on Yom Tiv at all? Amar lei, lo. Rabbi Zera said, no, I actually didn't say that, but rather, ana mistabra amri. They both said, this is very interesting. Rabbi Zera said, I never said definitively that the halacha follows Rabbi Shimon. Instead, what I said was, what? I said, it appears clear, it seems to me that the halacha follows Rabbi Shimon. Midiktani b'masnisin, Rabbi Shimon Omer, kol she'ein mumo nikar miba'od yom, ein zeh min hamuchan. Because Rabbi Shimon said, any time that the mum is not recognizable as of Erev Yom Tiv, that animal is not called prepared. V'katani la bebraisa belashon chachamim. And I both say, when that position is matched in the braisa, it's made to sound like a majority position. So Rabbi Zera said the fact that the braisa makes the position of Rabbi Shimon sound like a majority position led me to feel that b'pashtos halacha follows Rabbi Shimon, and we don't look at mumin on Yom Tiv because there's no point. Because if the mum wasn't established before Yom Tiv, the animal is not considered to be muchan. Shma mina mistabre kavase. And again, therefore, it sounds like the halacha, and therefore Rabbi Zera says that's why I felt the halacha follows Rabbi Shimon. My havi Allah. So what is the halacha? Right? We'll say again, what is the halacha regarding going ahead and looking at mumin on Yom Tiv, or well, it's on Yom Tiv. We'll say, I just point out, by the way, Rashi explains why was Rabbi Yehuda Nesiya when going ahead and sending out this shaila to everyone. So Rashi actually points out over here something very interesting. He says that Rabbi Yehuda Nesiya had a number of kohanim who were living in his home, who ultimately, again, relied on bechar animals as a source of their parnasa, as a source of their sustenance. That's why he was so eager to ask this shayla. Okay, in any event, we have Rabbi Zera now saying that halacha l'maisa, the halacha really follows Rabbi Shimon, and we don't look at mumin. So what is the halacha? Here we go. So the Gemara is Mahavi Allah, Amar Rabbi Yosef Tashma, the Talia Ba'ashli Rav Revi, Dam Rabbi Shimon Ben Paz, Rabbi Shimon Ben Levi, Rabbi Yosef Ben Shol, Amar Rabbi Mishum Kila Kedisha B'Shalayim, Rabbi Shimon v'Chaveirav Amru Halacha K'Rabbi Meir. Okay, so also listen to this. So literally, quoted a number of different people. The Talia Ba'ashri, everyone is supposed to say, means there is a ruling that is supported by strong ropes. Rashi says over here about 7-8 lines up before it gets wide. Ba'ashli Rav Revi b'chavolim gidolim v'gasim shekashin linote klomer chachamim gidolim amrua ve'nochin. So Ashli Rav Revi is a lashon that the Gemara uses when you have a ruling that was stated by great rabbanim. So great rabbanim, thick ropes, just like a thick rope holds something in place. So the thick ropes of Chazal said as follows: in the name of all these rabbanim, in the name of the Kehila Kedoshah Yerushalayim, the Holy Congregation of Yerushalayim, Rabbi Shimon v'Chaveirav all said that the halacha follows Rabbi Meir. Now both say, Rabbi Meir what? Rabbi Meir who? What are we talking about over here? So the Gemara says, V'ha inhu kashisha minei tuva. But 1 second, what do you mean you're quoting the halacha follows Rabbi Meir? These individuals who you're quoted were actually older than Rabbi Meir. So if they're older than Rabbi Meir, how are they quoting the halacha in the name of Rabbi Meir? So the Gemara says, Ella b'shitas Rabbi Meir amrua. Rather, again, these great Rabbanim held the same position of Rabbi Meir. What did Rabbi Meir hold? So the Gemara says, this nan, here we go. Hashochet es habachar va'achar kach hera es mumo. Both say very interesting shayla. What happens if you have a bachar that has a mum, but you didn't ask the shayla on the mum before the shechita? Instead, you shechted first and asked afterwards, right? So you shechted the bachar and then you showed the mum to a chacham afterwards. What's the halacha? So the Gemara says, listen to this. Rabbi Huda matir, Rabbi Meir omer. Rabbi Huda says that it's mutter. Rabbi Huda says that it's mutter. And Rabbi Meir says as follows. Hoil v'nishchat ad. Sorry. Rabbi Huda says it's mutter. Rabbi Meir holds hoil v'nishchat shalo api mumcha aser. Rabbi Meir holds that halacha l'maisa, since you shechted it, ultimately again, not al pia mumcha, not by an expert, therefore again it is going to be aser. So both say this is a fundamental machlokes here, Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda. Right? So again, you go ahead and you have a bechar that has a mum. You should have shown it to the chacham before you shecht it. You shecht it first. Let's say it turns out, by the way, that the mum is actually the type of mum that is matir a bechar. So does it work ex post facto or not? Rabbi Yehuda says yes. Rabbi Meir says no. Rabbi Meir says no. Alma kasav Rabbi Meir. So also listen to this. This is fascinating. Alma kasav Rabbi Meir. Re'iyas bechar lav kriyas treifa. Both say, so you see from here that the examination of a mum on a bechar is not the same as an examination of a treifa. Right? Because we'll say in general, when you shecht an animal, you have to examine the animal for simani treifa. But you see that these two examinations are dramatically different. How so? Here we go. So the Gemara says, Re'iyas bachar mechayim, re'iyas treifa lachar shchita. So first of all, number one, you have to examine a bachar while the animal is still alive. When do you examine a treifa animal? When it's dead. Furthermore, umina, re'iyas treifa afilu b'yamtiv, Riyas bachar me'erev yamtiv. Both say along those same lines, you could examine an animal for a treifa on yamtiv itself, because remember, once you have the heter to shecht, you also have the heter to what? To inspect the animal for treifas. However, riyas bachar, examination of the movement of a bachar, that can only take place on erev yamtiv. So both say, this is the shita of Rabbi Meir. When we said halacha chaz Rabbi Meir, what that means is, Rabbi Meir holds that halacha l'maisa, halacha, essentially what Rabbi Meir is saying is that the examination of a bachar is different than the examination of a treifa. On one level, because halacha l'maisa, the re'iyas treifa is after shchita, the re'iyas bachar is before shchita, and based on that, Rabbi Meir says re'iyas treifa could take place even on Yom Tiv, but re'iyas bachar can only take place before Yom Tiv. So when we said that the halacha follows Rabbi Meir, what we're saying is you do not look at mumin of a bechar on Yom Tiv itself. Ultimately, again, only on Erev Yom Tiv. So the Gemara says as follows. So the Gemara says, Amrlei Abaye Atu Hasan Baran Mumin Pligi. Are they arguing about? But it's the machlokes over here, Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Huda, are they arguing about looking at mumin? They're arguing about knas. They're arguing about knas. In other words, they both say, Rabbi Meir says, essentially there's a penalty. If you shech the bachar and you don't go ahead without first showing it to the Kohen, to the mumcha, there's a penalty involved in that. This has nothing to do with whether or not you're permitted to go ahead and look at mumin on Yom Tiv. This has to do with how do we penalize you, or do we penalize you if you shecht first and ask later. We'll say some people always do that, right? Shecht first and ask later. So the shaila is there a penalty for such behavior or not? Rabbi Meir will say yes. Rabbi Yehuda will say no. So I will say, for example, there are certain mumin that change after the death of an animal. For example, dukin sheba'ayin is often translated as cataracts, right? So if the animal has some type of eye injury, that could potentially be a mum that could invalidate a bechar animal. But we'll say the problem with inspecting that type of mum after death is that it changes. It looks different after the animal is dead than when the animal is alive. Therefore, you can't rely on a posthumous examination in order to go ahead and ascertain that it really is a mum. So the Gemara says, Kipli, gibe mumin shebeguf. So where do you have machlokes? With other mumin that are on the body of the animal. So the Gemara says, Rabbi Meir savar guys, mumin shebeguf, atu mumin shebe'ayin. I will say, so other mumin, see, one could make the cogent argument that you should be able to go ahead and examine the bachar for the mum after the animal is dead. Why? Why? Because a mum is a mum is a mum. You didn't eat it yet. So the shaila just is right now. Also, remember again, what's the worst think about this for a moment. What's the worst case scenario? Let's say you shechted it before you asked, and then it turns out, so what are our possibilities? If it's a mum, then what? Then it's yours. If it's not a mum, give it to the Kohen. Right? In other words, remember, someone is permitted to eat this. It's just the shaila of who's permitted to eat it. So what's the big deal? Oh, I'll tell you what the big deal is. The concern is that if we let you shecht before examination, for a mum shebegufa, a mum on the body of the animal, inachinami, it doesn't really make a halachic difference. After the death of the animal, after the shechita, we can examine the mum and decide who gets it. But where it does make a difference is, let's say, for cataract type of mumin, where the appearance of the mum changes after the death of the animal. Rabbi Meir says, we will not allow you to shecht first and ask later, because if we allow it by mumin shebeguf, you'll come to go ahead and do it by mumin shebe'ayin as well, and that could cause a problem. Rabbi Yehuda sabar, lo gazrin. Rabbi Yehuda says, no, we're not worried about that. People make enough of a distinction. They know that by cataract it'll change after death, but by mum shebegufo it will not. So the Gemara Rabbi Yehuda sabar lo gazrinon. Does Rabbi Yehuda really hold that we're not concerned? Amram nachar yitzchak masnis and avideka diktani. Rabbi Meir omer hoil v'nishchat shlo api mumcha aser. Rabbi Meir holds, once you shech the bachar without the psak halacha of the mumcha, ultimately again it will be aser. Shmamina kinasahu de kakanis shmamina. We'll say ultimately again, see that really what Rabbi Meir is saying is, we'll say it's a knas. It's knas. We'll say that interestingly enough, once you render something a knas, what's the halacha? Essentially, let me say it differently. Once you render something a penalty, a knas, it's no longer rooted in svara. Right? Knas doesn't have to have svara. That's what a penalty is, right? The difference between knas and din is often rooted in a logical construct. Knas is a penalty. Penalties are there to prevent people from doing things we don't want them to do. So Meir will say that halacha lamaisa, if you shecht first and ask last and ask afterwards, ultimately again will impose the penalty upon you. Incredible. So the Gemara goes right there. Ami vardina chazi brucha de benesia. Ami Vardina, that's his name. Rashi actually points out over here, the second to last line in Rashi, Vardina. Where does he get the name Vardina? Both say Vardina is Vered, rose. Rashi says, Noah haya va'ashem vradim haya nikra. So both say it's very beautiful. So he was a very pleasant man, either a handsome man, very pleasant in his actions. So he used to call him Ami the Rose. Ami the Rose. Rashi says that the other possibility is, he was from a place called Vardina. That's the other possibility, right? First one is so much nicer, right? He was such a sweetheart. That they called him Ami the Rose. Okay, so what happened? He used to look at bachar animals of the house of the Nasi on Yom Tiv. Right? So the Gemara says, so Ami Vardina Chazir Bokra de Benesia Hava Biyamatava. I'm sorry. He used to be the one who examined the bachar animals of the Nasi. B'Yom lo haba chazi. But on Yom Tiv, he would not look at blemishes. On Yom Tiv, he would not examine bachar animals. So the Gemara says, so what happened? Asu va'amru le'Rabbi Ami. They told Rabbi Ami that Ami Vardina does not go ahead and examine bachar animals on Yom Tiv. Amar lehu shapir ka'ava de lo chazi. Oh, that's right. That's good. He should not go ahead and look at bachar animals on Yom Tiv. Aha, Rabbi Ami gufei chazi. But Rabbi Ami himself is on record as looking at mumin on Yom Tiv. No, Rabbi Ami ki chazi me'esmal hava chazi. Both say now we're being introduced to something new. Even if you hold that you do not examine mumin on Yom Tiv, interestingly enough, if the mumcha looked at the mum on Erev Yom Tiv and pretty much saw that it's a mum kavua, but just requires a bit more clarification, you could do that on Yom Tiv itself. Listen to this. Say this is great. This is incredible. Even if, so we'll say, the Gemara is not saying like this. What would Rabbi Ami do? Rabbi Ami on Erev Yom Tiv would ascertain if the mum was a mum kavua or a mum over. Is it a permanent blemish or a passing, not passing, we'll call it temporary blemish. Now both say, here's what's fascinating. In Hilchos mum bebechar, it's not enough just to go ahead and ascertain that the mum is a mum kavua. In order to permit the animals to know, what else do you have to ascertain? That it was not intentionally inflicted upon the behema. So watch this. Ubiyamtiv shayule kameshayel hechi hava ovda. Shabbos, I listen to this. Rabbi Ami felt like this. The isser on Yamtiv is to paskin on the mum. It's to paskin on the mum. So as long as you take care of you, as long as you paskin on the mum erev Yamtiv, what can you do on Yamtiv itself? You could ask the follow-up shilas. What are the follow-up shilas? This is an interview with the owner. Tell me, how did this mum come about? Where were you on the, right? How did this mum come about? So the Gemara says, Kiha, it gives an example of this. Kiha, do gaver the IC buchra the kamei de Rava. There was a guy who brought his bachar, Yisrael, who brought his bachar animal in front of Rava. Apanya de ma'ale yamatava. Rabbi say, this is great. And when did he ask the Shiloh to the Rav? When did he come to Rava? On Erev Yantiv. What was Rava doing? Hava Yasiv Rava v'kachayif reishay. Rava was washing his hair. He was washing his hair. He was getting ready for Yom Tiv. And the guy brought his animal, came to ask a shayla on Erev Yom Tiv. Dali eine v'chazi lemume. So Rava looks at the mum. He lifted his eyes. He looked at the mum. Amarle zilha idna v'salamachar. Go away now and come back tomorrow. I mean, go away. He doesn't literally mean go away now. He just means, good, I got what I need. Come back tomorrow. When the guy came back to Rava tomorrow, Amar, hechi hava of the, tell me, how did your animal get this mum? Amarle, hava shajan sa'ari bahadach gisa dehutza, v'hava ihu beidach gisa, bahadi debay lemechel, ayil reishe upatre hutza lisafuse. So the owner said like this, my animal was on one side of the fence, there was a pile of barley on the other side of the fence, the animal stuck its head through the pile of barley, and what happened? When he stuck his head through it, he split its lip. So that's a mum. Amrale, Dilma Atgarantale. So Rava said, tell me, is it possible that you purposely put the barley on the other side of the fence because you knew the animal would stick its head through it and split its lip and get a mum, and therefore the animal would be yours to enjoy? Amrale lo. The owner said no. No, of course not. So why is the Gemara bringing this story? So you see a new wrinkle in this, which is that halacha lemaisa, we paskin, you can't look at mumin on Yom Tiv, right? So ultimately, again, the mum of a bachar must be ascertained before Yom Tiv. But what we do see is there are two parts to what we'll call the mum bachar verification process. Step one is this a mum kavua? Step two, did it happen unintentionally or intentionally? Step one, the mum verification must be done on Erev Yom Tiv. Step two, the drisha v'chakira, did any of this happen intentionally or unintentionally? That can be done on Yom Tiv itself. Amrlei, uminat teimra, digrama asr. By the way, how do you know that you're not allowed to inflict a mum on your animal? Right? How do you know that you're not? And even if we say, by the way, the Gemara is actually in grama, how do you know that you can create causation and cause the animal to become maimed and therefore become yours? Isanya mum lo yihye bo, because the pasuk Avosai says a mum shall not be on the animal, right? This is talking about just a general carbon, right? Mum lo yihye bo. Ainli elash lo yihye bo mum. Minayim shlo yigrom lo aidei davar acher. So we'll say, how do I know that I can't cause a mum to happen in the animal? For example, shalo yavi batzeg o devela v'yaniach al gabe ha'ozen kedei yavo ha'kelev v'yet Lerner. We'll say it's a great chap. How do you make a mum in an animal? Put a little dough on the ear of your sheep, right? Or on the ear of your carbon, on the ear of your bachar, or a little bit of dates. And what's going to happen? The dog is going to come. So we'll say, it's always the dogs. I just want to point it's always the dogs. Right? So what's going to happen? The dog is going to come and take a little nibble off the ear of the animal. And by doing so, ultimately it makes the animal a bal mum. How do you know you can't do that? Talmud lomar kol mum. Amar mum, v'amar kol mum. So we'll say, interestingly enough, the Gemara's drasha seems to be that Allah l'maisa kol mum, any mum, comes to teach you that Allah l'maisa, you are not allowed to engage in grama, to engage in causation and cause the animal to be blemished. So we'll say, how do we pass in Allah l'maisa? So first of all, Two important halachas come out from here. Number one, we saw the halacha ultimately by muktzah, right? Remember again, if something begins Yom Tiv, or Shabbos, it doesn't matter, Shabbos or Yom Tiv, mutter, then becomes aser, and then becomes mutter again. What's the halacha? What? It reverts back to its mutter status. Conversely, if something begins ben hashmashas aser, even if it changes and becomes mutter, what's the status of the muktzah? Remains muktzah, right? Isser is locked in at ben hashmashas. Hatter could flip-flop a little bit. Halacha l'maisa number 2, we do not look at mumin on Yom Tiv. We don't look at mumin on Yom Tiv. Now the reason for that, we'll actually learn later on, that's because in general we don't render halachic decisions on Yom Tiv because that has the appearance of being metakim, of fixing something. But what we do see, what can you do on Yom Tiv when it comes to Bachar? What can you do? Your drisha v'chakira. So in other words, as long as you know the status of the mum on Erev Yom Tiv, you can ask the follow-up questions on Yom Tiv. So Shabbos says, so the halacha is, we don't look at mumin on Yom Tiv, which Shabbos says such an incredible yisod. Because I'll point out something else, an interesting similarity. You know what else we don't do on Yom Tiv? There's another mum we don't look at on Yom Tiv, which is saras. Halacha l'maisa, if a Jew shows up to the Kohen on Yom Tiv with his negat saras, what does the Kohen tell him? The Kohen tells him, go home. Come back after Yom Tiv. So we'll say, isn't this incredible that halacha l'maisa, pretty much, we don't look at any blemishes, any mumin on Yom Tiv, whether it's a mum adam, whether it's a mum behema. Why Rabbi saying? Because the great power of Yom Tiv and the great power of the regalim is ultimately the power of cleansing. There are no mumin on Yom Tiv. There's nothing negative to look at on Yom Tiv. Because when we are ola regel ki ish echad belev echad, when we come before HaKadosh Baruch Hu, when we make the journey to come in the proximity of the Shekhinah, all is cleansed, all is pure, all is good. Right? After Yom Tiv, that'll be a different story. I will say, but that's the paramount. And again, it's hashkacha that we're learning this Gemara today on Hoshana Rabbah. Hoshana Rabbah, which again is the last day of Sukkot. Hoshana Rabbah, which is the Chasimas Hadin, as the Zohar says, the Piskin, right? The Petak, the little piece of paper with the judgment, are being delivered to the Beis Din Shal Mala. There's no mumin today. There's no mumin on Yom Tiv. So even though I may have messed up ultimately between Yom Kippur and now, right? I thought it was going to be a different year. But once again, I find myself engaging in the same behaviors just a few days into the new year. The good news is, today, HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, I don't see your mumin. Today, there's no mum. If I'm a behema, because sometimes I'm a behema. Sometimes I'm more behema than man. But even if I'm a behema, there's no mumin of a behema. Right? And even if ultimately, again, I have tzaras, there's no tzaras. Yom Tov offers us the incredible gift of a new slate. And if we maximize it, and if we build on it, it has the ability to erase all of the mumin of the past as well. Such an incredible use. So says the Mishnah, behema shemei. So what's another interesting case? An animal dies. Lo yizizena mimkoma. You can't move a carcass. Right? The carcass is muktzah. Similarly again, umaysa v'shalos Rabbi Tarfon aleha. So one time they asked Rabbi Tarfon about an animal carcass, or va'ala chala shenitmes, or ultimately again about chala which became tameh. V'nichnas lebeis hamedrash. Shabbos chala is the portion of the dough that's given to the kohen, so the chala becomes tameh. V'nichnas lebeis hamedrash v'shal, and he went to Vishur and he asked the shaila. V'amru lo yiziz even koman. So we'll say both an animal carcass as well as chala shenitmes. Now we'll say the interesting part about chala shenitmes, so we'll say is, remember, what can you do with chala that's tameh? What can you do with it if you're a kohen? Burn it. Now we'll say, so does that have a yom tov use? Sure. What can you use it for? Fuel for your fire. We're going to see that there's a specific prohibition about the destruction of kadshim on Yom Tiv. So this is not really an ochal nefesh issue, because you could find an ochal nefesh use for it. This is about that you cannot actively dispose of kadshim on Yom Tiv. So it says the Gemara, Leimatnan stama delok Rabbi Shimon. Our Mishnah must not reflect the view of Rabbi Shimon. This is not Rabbi Shimon Omer. Rabbi Shimon holds that you could cut up an animal carcass on Yom Tiv, on Shabbos, for dogs, which tells you that a carcass is fit for you. It's okay, I can't do anything for me, right? I can't eat it, but lamaisa I can feed it to my animals. So our Mishnah says that once an animal dies, what? Lo yizizim. You can't move it. It's muktzah. Rabbi Shimon disagrees, to which the Gemara Rabbi Huda Omer, Imlo Haisan Avela Me'erev Shabbos Asura. Now Rabbi Huda holds that halacha l'maisa, if the animal was alive at the onset of Shabbos and wasn't in Avela, if it becomes an Avela on Shabbos, or for that matter on Yom Tov, well here it's Erev Shabbos, it remains Asur. It remains Asur. So it sounds like our Mishnah reflects the view of Rabbi Huda and not of Rabbi Shimon, to which the Gemara says no. Afilu Tema Rabbi Shimon. Mode Rabbi Shimon b'balei chayim shemesu sha'asurin. Rabbi Shimon agrees halacha l'maisa with balei chayim, an animal that was totally healthy at ben hashmashas. Right? Rabbi Shimon will agree that halacha l'maisa, if that animal dies on Shabbos, halacha l'maisa it is muktzah. Sahani chalamar bar ameimar mishrei derava the amar mod the hay Rabbi Shimon b'balei chayim shemesu sha'asurin shapir. El lemar bereid Rav Yosef b'shnei derava damar chaluk hayar Rabbi Shimon afilu b'balei chayim shemesu shemutarim ma'ikol. I'm supposed to say, so apparently there's a machlokes in the position of Rabbi Shimon, right? A machlokes position. So one opinion says Rabbi Shimon agrees with Rabbi Huda regarding an animal that was totally healthy at the onset of Shabbos and then dies, that animal is going to be muktzah. But according to the opinion who holds, Rabbi Shimon holds that even in the case of a healthy animal that dies, and when I say healthy animal, it was healthy ben hashmashas, subsequently dies on Shabbos, Rabbi Shimon will still agree that Allah l'maisa, that animal is mutter to give to your klavim. What is there to say? Targama zi'iri bebehemas kodshim. What are we talking about over here, Bosei? The Mishnah is not talking about a stam animal. The Mishnah is talking about a sacrificial animal. A sacrificial animal, to which the Gemara says, Rashi says over here, bebehemas kodshim sha'asura bana u'tu'una kavura ve'enon niftis debaya hamada aracha inami impos. Listen to this. So perhaps the Mishnah is talking about a kodshim animal that died. So a kodshim animal that died. Remember, what can you do with it on Yom Tov if it dies? What can you do with it? Nothing. So the Gemara says, Dekanami diktani Allah va'alachala shenitmis. Machali dikadisha af behema dikadisha. Now we'll see, actually that makes a lot of sense, because the Mishnah is talking about two cases, right? Case number one is an animal that died. A case number two is chala, which became tameh. Chala is consecrated, so bepashtos, the behemon question is also consecrated. And in that case, even Rabbi Shimon will agree. So we'll say, remember again, it could very well be Rabbi Shimon holds that in general, if you have a totally healthy animal and that animal dies on Shabbos, what can you do? You can give it to the dogs. That's not a problem. But even Rabbi Shimon will agree that if we're talking about a behemas kodshim, right, a sacrificial animal, that Allah l'maisa will be muktzah. The reason why ultimately you can't move it on Yom Tov is because it's consecrated. Had chulin sharia. But if it was a chulin animal, ultimately what? It would have been permitted. Sahani chalamar breid Rav Yosef mishmei derava the amar chaluk hayir Rabbi Shimon af b'balei chayim shemesu shemutarin shapir. So again, according to the version that holds, so according to the opinion that holds that Rabbi Shimon held, according to the opinion of Rabbi Shimon, according to the version of Rabbi Shimon, that ultimately, again, Rabbi Shimon holds that halacha l'maisa, if it was a totally healthy animal, it would have been permitted, and you want to go ahead and set up this Mishnah l'divrei hakol, you set it up as a behem of kodshim. Elamar berei amimar mishrei derava da'amar modai Rabbi Shimon b'alei chayim shemesu shasurin ma'ikal amimar. But according to the opinion who holds that Rabbi Shimon holds that halacha l'maisa b'balei chayim shemesu, if a perfectly healthy animal went ahead and died, that it would be muktzah. What do you say in this case? So hachama askinon, how would we set up the case? B'misukenes v'divrei hakol. We'll say we can also set up the Mishnah as dealing with the behema misukenes. Behema misukenes means an animal which is deathly ill. If you take a look at Rashi Rabosai, take a look second wide line. Hachama askinon b'misukenes liolam Rabbi Shimon hi umasnisen b'misukenes deshari Rabbi Shimon ba va'amar mechatkenes hadalu and hilchach time up. Dikadshim lo yizizena ha duchulin sharia. So we'll say, interestingly enough, the Gemara says we could be referring to a situation of a misukenes. Now, interestingly enough, in a misukenes case, everyone would agree by a chulin animal that it would become permitted. But Allah l'maisa, if you set it up as a kodshim case, that ultimately again would be a situation where Allah l'maisa, the animal was not fit for anything. All right, so we'll stop over here for today. We'll pick up at Mirz Hashem With good, yeah. We'll pick up with the Mishnah and Mirat Hashem tomorrow. Sorry for the haste and speed through which we went through the daf, but at least now we're caught up where we're supposed to be. Shkayach, everyone. Correct.
So what we learn about the hammer?